Okay, the committee will come to order. This is the Water Quality Management Committee, Thursday, June 15th meeting. And the first item on the agenda is a presentation by Phil Colarusso from the EPA. Let me just give a brief introduction as to how he happened to be here. There was an article in the Enterprise a couple of weeks ago, a month ago maybe, about eelgrass and what was afflicting eelgrass was some sort of a creature that had Russian antecedents. But the story was put together based on research by a couple of people at Hui, who I called and said, what do you know about eelgrass? And they were not experts in eelgrass, but they said there was someone who was. And that turned out to be Phil Colarusso, who we've had a couple of conversations with. Every time I talked to him, until today, he has been out in an eelgrass bed. But today he's not. Today he's here, and it's a sort of a two-part presentation. One's the big picture about eelgrass, but the other is what you have found in Westfalen Harbor regarding the eelgrass and how it's doing there. So after the presentation, we're probably going to want to have some conversation with you. But please do.
Thank you for the opportunity. I wish I was out in eelgrass today. It's a beautiful day. Last week, not so much. So I was asked to talk a little bit about eelgrass and specifically nitrogen. And I could give the whole presentation just from this picture, but I won't. Picture on the right is actually Town Neck Beach in Sandwich. The picture on the left. Picture on the right is Stonewall Pond on the Vineyard. If you're familiar with Town Neck Beach, it's well flushed. Water quality is very good. Water clarity in particular is good. Stonewall Pond is off of Menemsha, that end of the vineyard, and it's kind of restricted, little flushing, high nitrogen. And as you can see, the eelgrass is not thriving as it is elsewhere. We'll talk about why that is. So just, I'm sure many of you know all this already, but I feel obligated to kind of talk about why we should care about eelgrass in the first place. It's ecologically very important species, nursery habitat, refuge and foraging habitat for many fish and invertebrates. It's an important primary producer, so it's the base of your food chain. Stabilizes sediments, so reduces erosion. Absorbs pollutants, nitrogen in particular, but also metals and other things. It filters the water column. There's a recent article put out over the winter that looked at bacterial infections in swimmers and how people swimming near eelgrass had a lower incidence of getting GI issues because the leaves themselves filter out particles from the water column, including bacteria. And if you're one of the 97% of scientists who actually believe in global climate change, which even though I work for EPA, I am. Wait, this is on TV, right? These habitats are important sequesterers of carbon, and that's actually where my current research is. And my work in Westfalen Harbor focuses on that, but it does touch on nitrogen as well. So I'll present some of that information. You did ask me to present a little bit of my dissertation, which I had to dust off, and so I have a little bit of that, which is more nitrogen specific. So we all know bay scallops, like eelgrass, and it allows them to get up off the bottom away from predators and closer to the resources, they're filter feeding animals, so they like to be up in the water column near phytoplankton. So it's a preferred habitat for them. As the climate changes and water warms, we get more blue crabs up here, and it's an incredibly important habitat for them as well. Both of these photos were taken on the vineyard. And believe it or not, there are actually eels in eelgrass. This was off the vineyard as well. And a quick story divergence. When I was a kid growing up just north of Boston, I would snorkel in tide pools, And I would see one American eel in this tide pool, and it would always come. They have very poor eyesight, and it would swim up to me, right up to my mask, and then see it was me and swim away. And this particular fish was out in the vineyard last summer, and I was swimming in Farm Pond, and it came right up to me, right up to my mask. I felt like it was an old friend visiting. I'm pretty sure it wasn't the same fish, but it is just fun the way they are curious. It's also important, like I said, for the primary producer and a source of carbon and direct forage for some species. So sea turtles, not so much here, but further south. Manatees and dugongs as well. At this latitude, we're more likely to see brant, which are a type of geese, or black duck. Our friends, some of the Canada geese, when they're not eating baseball fields, they'll eat eelgrass as well, and snow geese even further north. So how much light does eelgrass actually need? And that feeds into the whole water quality question. And it really depends on who you ask. There's a number of papers. There's a guy named Bill Dennison who kind of put out the seminal paper originally, which talked about this rule of thumb of about 20% of the ambient light is what needs to reach the plants. Now, for comparison, algae uses 3 to 5% ambient light, phytoplankton about 1%. So the light requirements of seagrasses are very much higher than any other plant in the sea. And so as a result, we actually use them as an indicator of water clarity and water quality. If the seagrasses are doing well, then everything else is probably going to be doing well and is protected. That 20% rule of thumb was done with experiments looking at adult shoots, and it doesn't really address the entire life cycle of the plant. And so additional experiments have been done. One by name of Carol Ocheng up at Fred Short's lab at UNH had done some work looking at light requirements for seedlings. So this is you probably all know this plant produces seeds. Sexual reproduction is part of its toolkit. And the seedlings, they don't have a lot of reserves to draw on, so they need a lot of light to grow. And so 50% of the ambient light is probably a more protective and relevant number to think about for completing the life cycle. Now, we all know that reproduction is expensive. Anyone who has a wife and a kid will know that. But producing viable seeds is very energy intensive. So you need good water quality, good water clarity, so the plants can photosynthesize, produce sugars, and then produce flowers and viable seeds that will keep the population going. So with all that, how much light does it really need? And it's despite all I just told you, it's really not that simple. There's a lot of other factors that go into this. And water temperature is a big one. Eelgrass is a cold water plant, and it actually does best. So when I say best, the optimal amount of photosynthesis. So two processes are going on within this plant at the same time during the day. It's creating sugars by the process of photosynthesis, but it's also undergoing respiration, so it's burning some of those sugars as well. And that's a normal decomposition process. Both are very much affected by temperature. And when I say optimal, the greatest difference between the photosynthetic production of sugars and the decomposition by respiration of those same sugars occurs at 5 degrees Celsius. So it does better and best at cold temperatures. Temperatures above 25, that rate of respiration increases faster than the rate of photosynthesis. So at 25 degrees, the plant actually starts consuming itself. So the temperature's above 25. So it can last for a period of time above 25 degrees, but extended periods of time above 25 are problematic. And especially if the water is cloudy or light is somehow diminished, the combination of high water temperature and diminished light is a problem. The other thing that this plant has to deal with is the sediments. Has an extensive root structure in the sediments, and high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide in the sediments can be toxic. But this species can modify its own environment. So by photosynthetic processes, it creates oxygen, which it will then it will oxygenate the sediments and make them more amenable for its own survival. But again, if light is diminished, then that photosynthetic production of oxygen is reduced, and hydrogen sulfide toxicity could be a problem. And I put the picture of the shark in the background because we were talking about stress. So that generally induces stress in most swimmers. That's actually from Farm Pond on the vineyard as well. Okay, so nitrogen in eelgrass. So nitrogen it's an essential nutrient. The plant needs it. But we need to think about the environment that this species evolved in. So it evolved in oceans that were very low in nitrogen. And so it's very good at scavenging nitrogen from the sediments primarily, but also from the water column, which is good when nitrogen is low. It becomes a problem when nitrogen is high. So too much of a good thing. Phytoplankton, microalgae, and epiphytes. Epiphytes are basically anything that will grow on the surface of the leaves. They can be more efficient absorbers of nitrogen, primarily from the water column, than eelgrass can. And it has to do with surface area and cell width and a variety of other cellular processes. But the proliferation of all these species, the end result is they block light from reaching eelgrass. The other end result could be, again, direct toxicity from high concentrations of organic material, hydrogen sulfide in the sediments, or high concentrations of nitrate in the water column, causing toxicity to the plants. And the picture in the background is also from the vineyard, and you can see all the fuzz kind of growing over many of the leaves of the eelgrass there. And obviously, you don't need to be a PhD scientist to realize that wearing a coat is not a good strategy if you're photosynthetic. Light is not reaching that tissue very efficiently. We did an experiment, not so much with these type of epiphytes, but some of the invasive tunicates that we find around here. And we actually measured how much light those species absorb, and they'll block 85 to 90% of the ambient light before it even reaches the plants themselves. So it doesn't take much tissue to kind of prevent or reduce the photosynthetic opportunities for this species. I've had the opportunity, unfortunately, many locations kind of doing a CSI recreation after a meadow has disappeared or declined as to what was causing it. And for nitrogen, there are some very telltale signs of nitrogen problem in seagrass. So one of the first things that happen is shoot density, which is the amount of shoots in a given area, will decline. And the reason that happens is the meadow will tend to thin itself out to reduce self-shading and to optimize the amount of light that reaches the remaining shoots. A very telltale sign is also the deep edge of the meadow will decline. So the meadow will start creeping into shallower water. That deep edge is typically, in Massachusetts, on the Mass Bay kind of side of the state, average deep edge depth is about 5 meters, so 15 feet mean low water. And Buzzards Bay, it's not that deep. It's, I would guess, probably more on the order of 3 meters, maybe 4. And again, that's all a function of water clarity. also as a function of as the shoot density declines, the amount of biomass in the meadow will decline. Epiphytes tend to increase. So again, all these growths on the plants will become more evident. Drift algae, you may get green algae, or currently we're experiencing a lot of red algae, invasive species from Southeast Asia, which is all over the place at the moment. I don't know if you've seen it down here, but we were diving in Rhode Island in the beginning of May and had a hard time getting to the eelgrass through all the algae. And we've had reports on the North Shore of Massachusetts, and we've been up in Maine, and it seems to be everywhere in shallow water. And I don't know if that is, I don't know enough about that species to know if that proliferation has anything to do with excess nitrogen or not, or if it's just because it's invasive and tends to proliferate. And the sediments will become organically enriched or anoxic. So, you get that rotten egg smell when you, take a sediment sample and then it looks completely black. So it's not aerated at all. Okay, so I had to dig back in the memory banks to get back to my dissertation. These are flow-through mesocosm tanks at UNH, and Fred Short was gracious enough to allow me to do some work there. We put 200 shoots of eelgrass in each of these tanks, and we, you can see how long ago it was. And we did a varying amount of nitrogen loading and a varying amount of flushing. So the nitrogen loading is, this is loading above background. So Great Bay, if you know anything about Great Bay is eutrophied. It has high levels of nitrogen. The plants were in there for a month. And so this is nitrogen above and beyond background. The flushing rate is the percent of the tank volume that is exchanged on a daily basis. So the higher the number, the greater the amount of water going through the tank.
So it was grams of nitrogen over 30 days, you said?
Yes.
That was the loading, the cumulative.
Yeah, cumulative, exactly. So it's like a slow release fertilizer that's put in and dissolves through time. The assumption is it does it in a linear fashion. And so what I was measuring was something called non-structural carbohydrates, which is a fancy term for sugar or starch, which is basically the end products of photosynthesis. So the hypothesis was with higher nitrogen and or lower flushing, that the plants would have lower quantities of starch and sugar in their tissues. So we look at both the leaf, the above ground material, and the rhizome, or the below ground material. And the plant tends to store most of their long-term storage, starch in particular, below ground. And that carbon reserve is important because it gets them through the winter when the days are shorter. Or if they lose tissue and they need to rebuild tissue, so if the leaf gets sheared and they need to rebuild photosynthetic tissue, they draw on that reserve from below ground. So this is the experiment from 1998. The asterisks are areas where plants didn't survive, so I had no tissue to analyze. And if you notice, those tend to be areas that had higher flush or higher nitrogen loading, but also the lowest lower flushing. So in this case, high nitrogen, lowest flushing for that exposure, and the same here. And again, you have high flushing here, high nitrogen, but still the sugar concentrations are depressed over, this is what would be considered the control. And I didn't, for the sake of this presentation, I didn't put in the standard error and do all the statistics, but take my word for it, that's statistically different.
Yes.
This is from the next year, from 1999, and again, the area with the tank with the lowest flushing and the highest nitrogen loading had mortality and had no tissue. And again, the controls had much higher concentrations, both in the leaf and the rhizomes, compared to any of the treatments. Though there's some suggestion, and I guess we'll go here, there's some suggestion that flushing can ameliorate to some extent the negative impacts of nitrogen, and that I don't think is probably news to anyone. That's why we dredge inlets and increase flushing sometimes. The high nitrogen, low flushing areas had the highest mortality rates, and just a general, this is an endpoint that can be used as a measurable endpoint in how the plants respond to stress. So if you're looking at a health index, and actually, the irony was that this week, 3 separate people asked me about my dissertation. I don't think that has happened since 2000 or so. And one of them was an investigator from Canada who was interested in this technique because they're developing a health index for their seagrass monitoring program. Okay, so this is our current research that I'm doing with a whole cast of all-stars from a variety of locations, including Spain. We're looking at carbon sequestration in eelgrass meadows in New England. And last summer, I spent literally 20 days in a row underwater at 8 different locations, Westfalen being here, but Great Bay, Gloucester Harbor, Nahant, Cohasset, Pleasant Bay, Lagoon, well, just outside of Lagoon Pond in the Vineyard, and Ninigret Pond in Rhode Island. And we deployed sediment traps. We took sediment cores in eelgrass and in reference areas. We measured eelgrass growth, shoot density, morphology. We looked at stable isotopes in the plant tissue, in the sediment cores, also in the material and sediment traps. The people from Spain were gracious enough to do lead-210 analysis so we could age the cores and know how old they were. And we measured water temperature and light using hobo sensors from Onset.
From Onset.
Yes, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with.
Yes.
They're great. For the best $49 I ever spent. And these are what our cores are coring. You have not lived until you've taken a core on scuba. We get about 30 centimeter cores consistently, and we segment them so like two centimeter intervals for the 30 centimeters and subsample them. This is just to give you a sense of where West Falmouth falls, and I should tell you, so where we sampled in West Falmouth is just inside the mouth of the harbor. So it may not be representative of the entire West Falmouth Harbor. It probably represents a best case. So this is shoot density, shoots per meter squared. So basically what we do is we have a quadrat of a certain area. We'll go out and haphazardly or randomly drop it in multiple locations, and while on scuba, go down and actually count the number of shoots within that square. And so you can see most of the meadows fall kind of within the 300 to 600 range. Cohasset is, we had samples of close to 1,000 shoots per meter squared, which is a very thick, lush meadow. And Great Bay is on the other end of the spectrum, just around 200 shoots per meter squared. So one of the things we actually measured, and one of the premise behind this study was, does nitrogen affect the ecological functions of eelgrass? So we were trying to get a range of nitrogen exposure, and actually I was a little bit disappointed in the spread of this data. And so this summer we're actually sampling further up in Narragansett Bay, Boston Harbor, and Portland, so I can get more data on this end of the scale. But this is percent of nitrogen in the eelgrass tissue, which is, there have been papers, Fred Short has done a nutrient pollution index that it's generally a good indicator of exposure to nitrogen. These plants will integrate water quality over time. So if they're in a nitrogen-enriched environment, that will be reflected in their tissue. And so Great Bay is the highest from last summer. And if you remember last summer, it was really dry. We were in the middle of a drought. And so I think in a typical summer, these numbers may be slightly higher. But you have, in years past, Great Bay has had plants in closer to the 3% range of nitrogen. The rest of these are all, I would say, within the normal range. Around 1% or slightly less. And West Falmouth is, right in the middle here. We measured growth, and again, this was for a 2-week period. And there's 2 ways, and this involves some really complicated, expensive science. So essentially what you do is you take a safety pin and you stick a hole in the plant. You put a cable tie around it, and you come back in 2 weeks. And the outside tissue is called the sheath, and that does not grow. But that pinhole, similar to like if you mark a tree, that pinhole will migrate on the inner leaves with time. And so then the growth is the difference between your reference point on the sheath and the leaf. And so you can measure that growth either by the distance that pinhole moved, or you can excise that tissue and measure the weight of it. And we did it both ways. And West Falmouth is kind of on the lower end of the scale for growth. But again, this was just a 2-week exposure in July. Better than Pleasant Bay, but not quite as good as Nahant or Great Bay.
But Cohasset, which is one of your better bays, also didn't grow that much either.
Yeah.
It's
and
not far off from West Falmouth.
Correct. And again, I didn't put the error bars in this because I put this together last night about 11 o'clock. But I would hazard to guess those two are not statistically different.
When you do these measurements and then the nitrogen measurements in the previous slide, do you scrape the epiphytes off?
Yes.
This is pure just plant biomass.
Yes, so we take a razor blade and I used to. Now we have interns. And they scrape everything off the surface of the tissue, and the tissue also gets rinsed with fresh water, so that there's no, especially when we're doing biomass, surprisingly, salt can add a fair amount of weight. So
the density in Great Bay is quite low from your previous slide.
Yep.
But the growth is relatively high. It's
Yep.
mid-range.
Mid-range, yep.
So there's not a correlation necessarily between density and growth.
Well, you're going to. I'm now going to integrate both of those, and we're going to look at production, which integrates the shoot density and that growth. And so that's where Cohasset leaps to the top of the scale here, because you have maybe individual shoot is not growing as great, but there's a lot of them. And so I think looking back at the Great Bay data, so this kind of validates that strategy by the meadow. When they're nitrogen stressed, they want to thin the meadow themselves so that the remaining plants can grow. And so with lower shoot density, more light is reaching those remaining shoots, and the individuals do well. But again, the meadow itself is not as productive. And so, again, Cohasset, really the production, and this is milligrams per meter squared, again, just for that 2-week period in July. Cohasset, primarily due to that high shoot density, is doing quite well. And the Nahant is a combination of intermediate shoot density and higher growth, as is Gloucester and Ninigret. And West Falmouth has, it's a little bit below the mean of the rest, but it's, I think this is actually Well, this is only one measurement, so we didn't do statistics on this, so I can't say that this is statistically greater than Great Bay, but it's substantially larger. And then, so we put out these sediment traps for 2 weeks just to see what we would be getting and how much material. And one of the things we didn't expect was to be getting more material in our reference areas. The reference areas are areas that are not vegetated. They're pure sand, or they don't have eelgrass. And I think what is happening in all of these sites is this, again, shows that eelgrass reduces erosion. And when you don't have vegetation kind of holding those sediments in place, you get a lot of sediment resuspension with waves, storms, boating activity, whatever. And so our reference area, reference sites are probably what that is reflective of is sediment resuspension, not necessarily new deposition. But the amount of material kind of making it into the eelgrass traps are really what we're interested in. And Great Bay, if you think about Great Bay, it has all those tributaries draining the southern third of, maybe even more than that, southern 40% of New Hampshire. So there's a lot of freshwater input. There's a lot of particle deposition going into Great Bay. The watershed around some of these other sites, Westfalen included, is not nearly as large, and the particle contribution from terrestrial sources is much less. And then we looked at what's the percent carbon in that material in those sediment traps, so you can see in West Falmouth, the material in the eelgrass is fairly carbon rich, and probably a lot of it is the eelgrass itself, but also phytoplankton, macroalgae, and that kind of goes to this. So we, with isotopes, we're able to distinguish where the source of the material is. So this is a nitrogen isotope and a carbon isotope. The green dots are eelgrass from our 8 different locations, and I'm sorry, I don't know which one of these actually is West Falmouth, but and the yellow ones are our sediment cores, and the blue ones are what's in the sediment traps. And this is actually what is reported for phytoplankton, macroalgae, particulate organic matter from the scientific literature. So one would think that a core or a sediment trap put in an eelgrass meadow would look more like the eelgrass, because the eelgrass is shedding leaves. You would think that that would be reflected in the sediments in that meadow or in the traps. But in reality, a large percentage of that organic material that's ending up in the meadow does not originate from the meadow. So the physics of it is the leaves are catching everything out of the water column and depositing it into the sediments within the meadow. That's where the whole concept of carbon sequestration comes from. It not only do they capture it, but they hold on to it for an extended period of time. So these are our 8 sites, and they're actually in order of, you can see the scale is different on all of them. So Ninnegard Pond actually had the highest percent carbon in the sediments, and this is with depth, and percent carbon on the x-axis going that way. West Falmouth is kind of on the lower end of the scale, but it showed a nice consistent pattern with depth, which, as you can see, not all of them had a nice linear response. There were some things going on at some of these sites that we're not quite sure about, but all of them, there's much more carbon in the sediment cores in the eelgrass than in the reference sites. So it verifies that eelgrass is beneficial to carbon collection, accumulation, and sequestration. And from our sediment cores, and unfortunately the West Falmouth core had a discontinuity that did not allow us to calculate an accumulation rate and a core age. But you can see from some of these other sites, some of our sediment cores sediments are over 100 years old. So it's not only, like I said, collecting the carbon, but it's holding on to it. And I guess the important point of that is it's believed that if we lose these habitats, all that carbon that's been stored for so long will be liberated back into the carbon cycle. And if we're worried about ocean acidification, climate change, that's a whole other source of carbon that's really not being accounted for in these global climate change models. And just from one of the statistics I've read that seems to catch everyone's ears on this is just from the global loss of seagrasses, mangroves, and salt marshes, which are the other two aquatic habitats that sequester carbon. We're adding the equivalent of emissions equivalent to Germany and Poland annually just from habitat loss. And again, that's not being accounted for in any of NOAA or anyone else's climate change modeling. Obviously, that's not sustainable. So that's why there's not a lot of this type of data, unfortunately, around. And so we're trying, this is all, the term of art is called blue carbon, blue because it's aquatic. So that's kind of the impetus behind our study. So at this point, I guess I'll let you ask any questions. And this is from, so one of the things I have to admit is I'm a seagrass nerd. And so when we go on vacation, I'm always looking for, this is actually in the Mediterranean off of France. My wife has pictures of, I don't know, the Eiffel Tower and other stuff. I have pictures of seagrass.
Very nice.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
You're welcome.
Really good.
I've got two questions. The first is from the first part of your talk, where you used grams of nitrogen and flushing rate.
Mm-hmm.
Did you consider changing that into nitrogen concentration?
It's hard to do. Most people, because nitrogen is so ephemeral in the water column, that I'm not sure how you could get a really good, accurate assessment of quote-unquote exposure. You'd need a really lot of samples and or a lot of money to kind of get a handle on that. So most people who are doing this type of work in mesocosms, they don't even bother to measure water concentrations.
Okay, and then in the middle of the talk, I kept hoping there would be a slide where you had growth rate versus light or temperature or nitrogen concentration or all of the above.
I do have a slide on that. It's not in this talk. I extolled the virtues of Onset and their HOBO sensors. Now I'm going to tell you why they're not great. They measure the wavelengths of light that the plants don't use. So they give a good indicator of, in general, light exposure, but they're not measuring photosynthetic active radiation, which is really what you need to correlate to that growth. And there are things called PAR sensors where you measure those wavelengths, but they're really expensive. And the good thing about the HOBOs is that you leave them, they're continuous measures, and if you lose them, you don't care. PAR sensor is thousands of dollars, and if I lost that, I'd be a little bit upset. Many people doing this type of work we use the HOBO and the HOBO data as kind of a comparative between sites, but it's kind of a stretch to then try to numerically correlate it to growth.
Thank you.
So I think one of the big things this committee is wondering about is once we get the nitrogen problem under control, how long is it going to take for eelgrass to recover once the water quality
3 hours, 12 minutes.
Improves.
No. That's a great question. There are many things that go into answering that question. So I'll give you examples of where other communities have reduced nitrogen and then what happened. So the three that leap to mind that are most relevant around here are the City of Gloucester, City of Boston, and New Bedford. So Gloucester reduced nitrogen by essentially moving their outfall out of Gloucester Harbor out into Mass Bay. And that happened in, I want to say like 1992 or 93. There was a lag time between that happening and eelgrass responding, showing a positive trend of, I want to say, somewhere between 6 and 8 years. We all know that the Tmdl moved their outfall out into Mass Bay as well. And that, fortunately, has been one of the most studied ecosystems around. And we have good data on eelgrass distribution in the northern part of the harbor in particular. And so the outfall moved in 95. The Tmdl doing systematic sampling of the benthos with cameras, and these called SPI, sediment profile imaging, where the camera actually penetrates the surface of the sediment and you get a vertical slice of the sediment and what's on top of the sediment. And so they've been doing that for, I don't know, probably 20 years or more at this point. And I think it was 2010 or 2011, one of their sites, which had formerly been essentially black mayonnaise, then it switched to amphipod, so little crustaceans that form tubes. Then it went to eelgrass. And this is on Deer Island Flats, which was arguably the most contaminated spot in the harbor at one time. And so a large meadow formed there, and it's actually the meadow that I'm sampling this summer. The next time you fly out of Logan, if you go out runway 22, if you look down, there's 3 separate meadows now totaling probably 120, 130 acres right at the end of the runway.
And that's about 10 years?
20.
15 to 17 years.
Yeah, okay.
In New Bedford, the recovery was, again, on the order of probably 8 to 10. You know, they upgraded their sewer system. They did some work with CSOs. They didn't move the outfall, but they actually did some restoration work as well, which probably sped up the process a little bit. But it depends. I'm not familiar with the area that you're talking about, but if the area is enriched and has the anoxic sediments, it will be a while for nature to kind of remediate those sediments to make it amenable for eelgrass to grow in that type of environment.
So that leads to my other question, which is it possible for those that are impatient to plant eelgrass, but I think if you don't have the right sediment conditions, then it's not going to take.
Yeah, it's possible. I've done a fair amount of transplanting work over the years, and I am frequently surprised at what works and what doesn't, and where it all of a sudden decides to grow and where it looks perfectly great and then it doesn't. It's worth trying, and there are different methods. They tend to be labor intensive, and depending on who's doing the labor, could be expensive. So you may want to start at a modest scale. And typically when we do restoration, like we just did a project with the Navy in Newport this past beginning of May, The irony was the Navy told us they had no boats that we could use. We had to bring our own. But we put out 5, we did what is called test plots. So we planted, I think, about 1,700 shoots over 5 different locations in the beginning of May. I'm going back, we put them in these frames called turfs. I'm going back right after the 4th of July to retrieve the turfs and kind of do some shoot counts and see how they're doing. And then we'll come back at the end of October and do another check-in and see how they're doing. And if any of those sites are viable in October, then next year we may try a larger effort.
Where did the 1,700 shoots come from? So they're actual plants?
Yes, so we have a donor. You need to find a donor or multiple donor meadows, hopefully in the same general location so that they're kind of acclimated to those areas. So in this case, there are a couple of meadows right on the Navy base that we were able to access. And 1,700 shoots for any of these meadows, for meadows of any size, there's literally millions of shoots. So 1,700 shoots is not, it's a trivial amount within the grand scheme of things. But it took, so we had 4 divers, 6 people on the shore for the better part of a day to harvest everything. And then we came back the next day and had 2 boats and same number of divers and a couple of extra shore support people to put everything back in the water at the different locations.
And how deep was the water in which you planted it?
Shallow, 2 to 3 meters.
2 to 3 meters.
Yeah, probably closer to 2 than 3.
Okay.
Mean low water.
I have a question on, when you talk about eelgrass restoration and it taking that amount of time, I think a corollary question is, what would you recommend if you were going to evaluate improvement in the eelgrass bed as you do water quality restoration? Like what are good things to study?
What would you look for? What
So
parameters?
what endpoints? What
Yeah.
monitoring endpoints? Shoot density is a very simple, easy measurement that just about anyone can do, assuming that the water's not too deep, or if you have divers that have that can get access to the meadow. That gives you a generally good indication of how the meadow is doing. The other is, obviously the state has mapped West Falmouth Harbor with their aerial photography, and I guess USGS has recently done drone work, which I've seen. And I actually, and this wasn't even planned, I actually have a proposal in that hopefully will get funded that will have us looking at satellite imagery of West Falmouth Harbor and coming back and doing some additional sampling next summer and the summer after. And so we may be able to help you collect some of this information going forward, at least for the next 2 summers. And we'll have some historical data to compare it to, so that may be useful.
Following up on that, in your experience, the data sets that we have now as to what quantities of eelgrass exist now and in the past, how accurate do you think they have been?
Are you referring to like the DEP?
The DEP areas.
Stuff?
Yeah.
Our use of that data is, we always tell people that it's a good first step, a good first stop, and for trend analysis, I think it's fine. But if I was on a conservation, I am on a conservation commission, but if I was on this conservation commission or in this town and someone came in with a project and said, here's the DEP map, I want to put my dock here, and it's outside of eelgrass according to the DEP map, I would probably still make them do an in-water survey because those aerial surveys are great for statewide assessment. They have some weaknesses when you're getting down to a very site-specific scale. And that's not a criticism of the people doing it, or that's just a...
But you think they're good enough as a baseline to show 10 years from now
Yes.
a given estuary is getting better or
Yeah,
isn't?
I think it's fine for trend analysis as long as the methodology is kept consistent. And so, the state is now, Mass Division Marine Fisheries is also doing some of this mapping stuff, and they're using acoustic sonar, boat, towing a sonar off a boat and doing transects, and we've done that as well, and that's a perfectly fine technique, but it's different than the aerial. And so I would be a little bit hesitant to compare between methodologies. Although that's exactly what we're going to be doing with the satellite imagery. We're going to compare that to the state's aerial imagery and this USGS drone stuff, which the drone stuff was fascinating to me. It's, I guess the theory behind it is they take a series of photographs over a very short period of time, and they have a computer program that will identify motion. So that's how they map the eelgrass. It's not by looking at a dark signature on an aerial photograph and drawing a line around it. It's the computer interprets where has something moved. And the theory being that the plants will sway with the water, and if you get a time series of photographs, it seems like a pretty logical approach. So it will be interesting to compare that to the standard aerial photography and/or whatever the satellites show, which are just one-time passes.
I just have thank you very much for Grant's presentation, but I have a few questions, but I think I'll just limit it to two. There was you didn't discuss disease at all, and the 1931-32
Yep.
wasting disease thing that wiped out a good part of New England at least.
All of the East Coast.
Yeah, all the East Coast.
Yep.
Is there any indication of how that took place, or whether you're seeing any wasting disease elsewhere around?
That's how or why it took place. Do you want to go back for your PhD? Because that's a great PhD project. I don't think it's well understood what the disease is. Always in just about every meadow at some latent level, but what triggers it to kick into an outbreak and cause fairly rapid decline is unclear. And I've seen up close and personal this is both in 1995, Cohasset and Hingham, where I was in a meadow in July, 70-acre meadow in July in Hingham, and came back to the same exact GPS coordinates in the beginning of September, and that 70 acres was gone. There wasn't anything left. And I don't have, documented proof that it was wasting disease, but there were very few things in my mind that could cause that large of a decline in that short period of time. And there was literally nothing. The sediments were not, it wasn't a dredging project, there wasn't a boat that went by, it wasn't grazing by geese, it was not green crabs, which have been known to devastate meadows in a short period of time. So I believe it was a disease incident. Now, there's actually a student at Northeastern, I'm on his dissertation committee, who is studying this and studying the genetics of the disease organism. Because it's now turning out that there are, like everything else, it's not quite as simple as we thought, that there are multiple strains of this organism, some more virulent than others. And so it may just be that all the disease, the latent amount of disease we're seeing in any of these meadows are just a strain that's not very virulent.
Okay, just the second question could be
Yep.
related somewhat, but in the Chesapeake, they've had a huge die-off of eelgrass as well, and I'm just wondering if more intensive harvesting of filter feeding bivalves could lead to, in part, to some of these problems because of transparency issues would be what you're talking about, light. I mean, if you don't have the material being taken out of the water to an extent, in addition to the nutrient loading, but if it's being harvested, because in 1929 we know there was a crash of the economy, and maybe everybody ran out and started harvesting shellfish for dinner. I don't know, but whether that was filtering out, they were filtering out some of these disease vectors, but not that would be my thesis for my doctoral program.
That's a good one.
But I would just say that,
How the Depression led to eelgrass diet.
but no, I'm just wondering, it seems that there could be some correlation in that the bivalve harvesting may be exceeding a kind of sustainable balance in terms of clarity of water and growth, as well as some of these other other forms of algae that are growing on the eelgrass, because there's more nutrients available and they're just taking off maybe more competitively than the eelgrass itself. So if the nutrients are there and the light is isn't there, it could be a combination.
I was wondering how long we're going to wait till we get to oysters, which I kind of figured we'd get to at some point. Do you remember the first slide? So the very first slide in this, which is Stonewall Pond. So this area right here. So in 2012 and 2013, we did a study in Stonewall Pond looking at filtration by invasive tunicates. So not measuring filtration rates in shellfish, but looking at the prevalence of these invasive tunicates, which are actually, on a per gram basis, more efficient filter feeders than oysters or any of the shellfish. And the reason we started down that road was my friends at Woods Hole, who directed you to me, were doing work looking for tunicates, and Stonewall Pond is a backwater area that's hard to access. And I happened to be out on a boat and snorkeled back into the Stonewall Pond and had nothing to carry anything with, but found a bunch of interesting things that I'd never seen before, put them in my mask, swam back, and Mary Carmen, who's the woman from Woods Hole, who's a tunicate expert, almost fell off the boat, looking at these species that normally are not here, normally are not growing on eelgrass. We got 2 papers out of the work we're doing there on tunicates, and the point, how this all relates to your question is, in this system, there are not necessarily shellfish, but there are organisms that are filtering the water, and to the point where we calculated they could filter the entire volume of Stonewall Pond in less than a day. So we're thinking that a lack of filtration isn't necessarily a problem in Stonewall, and yet, you still have, I think, an issue with nitrogen here. You still have plants that are overgrown with epiphytes, shoot density is kind of low, and the ironic thing is, if you're familiar with that area of the vineyard, I mean, there are a few houses kind of around the pond that are are definitely on septic, but it's not one of the more densely populated parts of the vineyard. It's a really poorly flushed pond. There's a one bridge with an inlet, and that's it. And so the combination of the septics around the pond, the low flushing, is enough to result in in this kind of environment, even though we have all these filter feeders in there as well.
Well, after they filter the water, what happens to the fecal? Is it similar to bivalves? Do you end up with deposition and this kind of thing?
Particle deposition
It basically does a similar.
Yeah. We also did stabilize soap. We found the other bad thing about the tunicates, well, besides the fact that they grow on eelgrass and they don't allow the eelgrass to photosynthesize, they're feeding on the same thing that scallops, cohogs, and other shellfish, commercial shellfish, feed on.
Mhm.
So they're competing for those same resources. So I think it's part of, I am all for a balanced system, and certainly abundant shellfish are part of any balanced system. And I know people have in Long Island Sound and in Great Bay, where there's also the issue of nitrogen and how do we control nitrogen, have done modeling exercises looking at how many acres of oysters do we need to put in lieu of doing nitrogen control. And I think some of the numbers that they're showing are staggering. They would have to cover, I think, 3/4 of the bottom of Long Island Sound. And again, shellfish, to me, it's kind of like putting the cast on the broken leg, because shellfish are feeding on the phytoplankton, which are absorbing the nitrogen and causing a bloom. And what ideally we'd like to do is prevent that bloom in the first place. So if you're thinking about biological control of nitrogen, I think you're better off with macroalgae, which absorbs it directly. So some people, like in Long Island Sound, they've talked about using kelp.
But it shades also.
It does shade, but you can put it in areas where there's no eelgrass, and it needs much less light than eelgrass does. So there are probably parts of West Falmouth Harbor that are not currently vegetated by eelgrass that could support macroalgae, and that's a more direct remediation of the nitrogen than shellfish.
Well,
You need to remove that out of the system, though,
right.
at the end of the growing season to have any effect.
Right.
But
Well, that's what we've been, in terms of the approach that.
and I should
Yeah.
I should qualify. I'm speaking only for myself. This is not
Yeah.
EPA recommending you do
Right,
any
okay.
particular thing.
Right, okay. No, I'm just saying that the way we tend to look at the total maximum daily load of nitrogen that has been sort of set, and therefore there's an excessive inflow from septic or wherever it's coming from. And then the notion is that each shellfish has so much nitrogen in it.
Yeah.
So if we have to remove 4 tons, how many shellfish do we need to do that? And as trying to meet that, which is what the sewer systems are basically
Right.
targeted to do as well.
Yeah.
So it's so in that case, we know we're taking out an animal, and then there's an associated microbial denitrification that can
Mhm.
go along with that. But that's sort of the way we've been looking. I think that most of the towns around here have been looking at that.
I'm sure all of the towns on the Cape have been thinking about that, and there are many potential issues with shellfish, unlike some of the more technology-driven solutions. Shellfish are seasonal at best, and oysters in particular, they like certain, if you get too high a water temperature, too low a water temperature, they won't filter. If the particle concentration in the water column is too high or too low, they won't filter. So they have a very preferred range of when they're actually doing what you want them to do, which is, I guess, limits some of their effectiveness. And I am all for oysters in general. They make great habitat for fish and other things, and they're part of the natural environment. I am not sure that they are the ultimate solution for our eutrophication issues.
We could talk about this for a while, but
We're going to talk about it next, in fact.
Oh,
Our
okay.
next agenda item is our West Falmouth Oyster Bed Project.
One observation, the south, we're focusing on the southern coastal ponds in Falmouth, half a dozen of them, and they are almost identical geologically in every other way to the southern coastal ponds of Martha's Vineyard. Ours are hugely densely populated. We got 8,000 people around these ponds. The vineyards are not densely populated at all. In fact, they're as close to unpopulated as you can get on the East Coast, yet we're both having the same problem. And how do you reconcile that?
I spent this morning on a conference call with friends from Corps of Engineers, Mass DEP, talking about Tisbury Gray Pond. They're removing munitions from that pond and potentially uprooting eelgrass in the process and having to restore it. I think part of it is, again, the flushing question, because some of the ponds in the vineyard are, flushing can be fairly limited. The other is, I don't know about your ponds, but they're actively commercially scallop harvesting. If you've ever been behind a scallop harvester, you'll see lots of, as they're dragging their, their apparatus, you'll see a lot of eelgrass uprooted. So I think the combination of those things are contributing to their issues.
Okay.
That's not to say, I mean, some of the meadows are doing quite well on the vineyard, and in fact, I did a restoration with the town of Chilmark, helping, I should say I did it. I provided advice to the Shellfish warden, Isaiah Schaefer, who did a wonderful job of actually going out and doing the work, and called me a few weeks ago and said everything we put in actually grew. And so there are success stories. It's not all dismal, but I think there are lessons to be learned for you from what's happening over there.
Did he take his shoots from a nearby
He did.
eelgrass?
He took it from Menemsha.
Okay.
So
Great, thank you.
Do you think West Falmouth, the part you dealt with, would be ready for shoots to be planted?
the part I dealt with doesn't need. Part I dealt with was beautiful.
Okay.
You don't need to do any restoration in that part of West Falmouth Harbor, and it, to me, would be a viable donor location for restoration for other parts of West Falmouth.
That's good to know.
Okay, so that's good to know. Any other comments or questions from the committee? Any comments or questions from the audience or the Fourth Estate? No? Thank you very much
All
for
right.
coming.
Yes.
My pleasure.
Our next little piece here actually has to do a little bit with West Falmouth Harbor, and you might be interested in sticking around for it.
Yeah.
I did a little presentation. We sent around the final report on the West Falmouth Oyster Bed project. And I've got 6 or 7 slides where I'm just going to highlight some of the things that we found and that we did. For those of you who don't know where Snug Harbor is, it's right here.
It's actually east of there. It's the next body of
Is
water.
that this one over here? I was looking
They're
at that.
right there. That's Snug
Yes.
Harbor,
This is
and
Snug
that's
Harbor.
that's
And
the
that's-
creek coming in from
And
the
this
upper
is
west.
Mashapaka.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Right. So this is Snug Harbor in here. And this is actually a better map where we have the Nashawina Street Bridge and Mashapaka Creek coming down. The bigger area is the area that we permitted. The orange is where we grew out the remote set, and the red is where the oyster bed is planted. This started in 2014. As I went back, I thought, wow, we've been doing this for a while. And the first thing this sort of came about after we had frozen Cape Cod and frozen Woods Hole, and we recognized that even though all of these areas freeze in a bad winter, there was still water running in Mashapaka Creek. And you guys remember Matt Weeks. Matt and I talked about if we were going to try to do an oyster bed, and I wish John Waterbury were here because this is something he's very keen on, this would probably be a good location to try. So we put out bags and stocked them at about 1.5 liters with cornflake size oysters, and just watched them over the season. It was a quick viability study and found fairly unequivocally that south of the bridge is a great growing location. We got much higher volumetric increase there, even though we have 20 parts per per thousand salinity in the upper reaches. I mean, it was plenty of salinity. It did just grew way better in the lower areas. So that's where we focused on for growing, and that was 2014. So you guys may recall we got a SNEP grant to do this development, and we always, Marine Environmental Services likes to walk before they run, so we started with 500 bags just to test viability and growth. And you can see those are the 500 bags, and we had some trays, and things grew incredibly well. And so those are pictures from the fall of the first year growth, and then we dove and got some from the spring, just they made it over the winter. I'm sorry there's not a scale bar on this, but that's my thumb. So you get an idea. They're about 2 inches. And here's just an underwater picture of the oyster bed that was bottom planted in the spring of 2016. So with all that happiness and good growth, we decided to really roll it out. And last summer, seems like a long time ago, we actually ordered 1,500 bags of remote set, but found out in July that we actually had to deliver the culch, which is the actual shells, and then our ARC, who was going through some transitions, would set these oysters on this for us. Took them a little while to do it, but we finally got our remote set, 1,500 bags worth, and you can see the bags on that trailer, and there's other pictures in the report, kind of what this all looked like. And what we did is we put all those bags in floating bags, because what we want to do is give the oysters a head start. We've seen over and over and over again, if you take remote set and you stick it on the bottom, it will die. But here, what we did is we got it through its first growing season, kind of the nursery stage, and we thought maybe we'd get 500,000 oysters out of these 1,500 bags, and then we planted them on the bottom. And so this is a picture. You remember Jenny Rubin? She helped us. We did the population study in the fall just to try to understand how much oyster had grown in the volume that we had, so we knew how much we bottom planted. And they were doing the acidification study at the same time, so we just happened to show up and they happened to help, so we got some pictures. So that's how the oysters looked in the trays and the bags. They just grew really well. Jen's holding the first year oysters that continued to grow from the 2015 study, so they got really pretty big, about hand size. And what we found, this is a very quick overview because we have a big agenda today, that we found several key things, and the details are in the report. We had great survival, obviously, of the oysters that we could see, because you don't know what died if you never saw it. But if the spat developed, it turned into oysters. We didn't have high mortality at all in the oysters that started out and got to a point where you could see if they were dead or alive. And we got about 30 millimeters from nothing, and that's about the same growth from that truncated period. I mean, our growing season is really May. We like to start in May, and you can get almost ½ an inch if you start in May, but starting in October, the 30 millimeters was great growth. We did some estimates based on the population count that we got of about 300,000 oysters, a little lower than the 500. And if you take the Reitzma figures, Josh Reitzma, who has published about the nitrogen content in the shell and the soft tissue, and we based it on a bottom planted oyster, which is more nitrogen filled than a floating bag oyster, because the shell is thicker basically, that you get we got about 50 kilograms per year if they were taken out of the system. And they're not, they're filtering. If you do the math on what it took to run the program, if you were to do this, it comes out a little bit high, not crazy high, but about $272 per kilogram. And I think the key to this is understanding that shellfish can be much less expensive if you get an economic value for the product. So in this particular case, we're not harvesting it, we're building a bed, so all of the costs, there's no cost recovery. I mean, a grower, and it does it, and it's, $10.
Costs are sunk here.
There you go, there's sunk cost. We realize that if you do site selection and viability testing and you get good results, it's a good way to make sure you're going to have ongoing results. And another feature of this location is the visibility. A lot of people came by in kayaks, a lot of people were on the bridge yelling at us, asking. So it was a wonderful time to talk to people about the general ecological benefits of water quality. And so we've got this bed planted, and it's outside of this was a report for the grant that we got. Our plan is to go out in the fall and to dive and to see and to take pictures of what the oyster bed is doing now. And one of the things that we're seeing, frankly, is a lot of alga growing on oysters that were planted. I mean, it's a very interesting phenomenon, and we're going to try to drill into this summer. And if you've got any interest or insights, I'd love to talk to you more about this phenomenon that I think we're creating a substrate that's catching, whatever, spores or whatever it is, and we're getting this growth, and we're just going to we're really going to look at what happened to this oyster bed, because it doesn't kill the oysters, it just hides them. So, just a quick.
If I did the arithmetic right, you should point out that the $272 is peanuts in terms of what the oysters are worth.
Yes, it is.
It's almost negligible.
It's negligible. You can make money growing oysters.
Yeah.
Sorry.
For shellfishing?
Pardon me?
Is that area open for shellfishing?
No. This is a non, well, yeah, where the bed is actually open for shellfishing, but it's not going to be open right now. We're still doing our experiment. I mean, we're still trying to test and see how things grow and develop.
Well, I mean, the whole economic question. So Division of Fisheries have an issue with putting shellfish in closed areas where a lot of areas may be closed due to water quality.
Right, an attractive
Yes,
nuisance.
Attractive nuisance.
Absolutely. No, right, so that where the bed was planted is in, I mean, all of West Falmouth is conditionally approved,
Yeah.
so nothing's open in the summer, but it is harvestable, but we really want to see how the survival happens over periods.
Just a couple of things. It's hard, how did you consider dealing with the issue of the many different impacts that are going on? Because this could apply to other things. In other words, the wastewater treatment facility has a 3 milligram per liter effluent, apparently, and therefore, if that actually kicks in, when you're measuring water quality with the oysters, you may be actually measuring an improvement from another source, or from the IA systems that have been put in. So as we move forward with these various projects, how do you pull out the different impacts relative to the same water column? I don't. It's a question to ask, because we're dealing in the real world, and we're trying to do science with a lot of variables. So it's a little complex. Maybe there's an idea about that. And the other thing, the $272, I'm not sure where that came from, because when I look at the table 2 planning budget for oyster bed development, I'm not sure exactly what that is about from the text, but it comes with a $60,000 figure with some, $60,000 basically, and at 50 kilograms of nitrogen, that's $1,200 a kilogram.
How many years did you, and
just
it's all actually in the text, how that number of years. So we assumed the oyster bed was going to stay.
Over 2 years.
Did I say that in the text?
This says 5 years here.
5 years, okay.
Yeah, they're talking amortizing the gear, the remote set, and labor expense over 5 years. Then it becomes $280 is the figure here in the table.
It wasn't clear to me from the figures that were here, because it says labor, seasonal position. Seasonal is $20,000. So is that 5 years? 20,000 for 5 years? I just don't know from looking at this how it came to that number. It's not clear to me.
All right,
Patrolling
we'll go
is
over that. We can-
patrolling is $2,000. Is that 1 year or is that 5 years? I don't know. Remote set purchase,
SNP
24,000.
understood it because they accepted the report, so I'll have to look back at the actual.
Yeah, okay. I mean, some of the gear I can see will last several years. It's listed here, so that would be.
So you want to know how the dollars per kilogram were calculated?
I don't know, and also.
Well, I think it's written in the report, but I can go over it.
Okay. And also, just the other thing about how do you decide if you're measuring this water quality, suddenly if the wastewater treatment plant actually does kick in the way everyone anticipates.
So that's the same point, right, the same,
Right,
you want to know how you disaggregate water quality improvements?
Right. That aspect, I mean, outside of calculating what's in the oysters
Yeah.
and whatever.
That's actually a good point that Brian has brought that up a long time ago. you can't mix your experiments in the same place and expect to.
Whether you can or can't, I don't know exactly, because
Yeah.
there may be ways to do it. It's just that there might be a very specific element that we may know, very specific.
Well,
Just take.
yeah, I mean, we can look at nitrogen in the creek. Of course, we know that's where the vast, I don't know the numbers, but of course that's where it's mostly coming into the harbor, in the creek itself.
You know, the
And-
purpose
And then
of-
do the modeling and figure out what it would be if the oysters didn't impact it below it. I'm guessing, I mean, I don't know. the
Well, we can
numbers.
get some rough estimates maybe, but I just don't know.
But it does, it's a confusing variable. I'm
Yeah.
trying to sort that out. And see, have they got salinity recordings over time in the creek itself? Because
We took grad samples.
no, for the salinity, you just took a few.
We just did them for that first year.
Is there any chlorophyll?
Because I'm learning at different tide cycles, I'm guessing the salinity could be quite low at low tide.
Right, we did them at low, and I mean, I'm going back to 2014.
Yeah, sure, I know, I'm just trying to figure out, it'd be,
It could have been lower, but it's pretty tidal up, there is a tidal influence.
right, and I'm
In-
just saying, as soon as the tide drains out, then, and again, I don't know the numbers, but there's a tremendous flux of groundwater into the creek
Right.
there. Of course, the groundwater that's loaded with nitrate, but it's also fresh groundwater, and I don't know whether it could be 20 parts per thousand up stretches of the creek there or not. It might be quite a bit lower.
I think in 2014, all we really cared about is where do they grow the best.
Right, and in this case, I'm thinking that the controlling factor might be, you know, when the salinity does drop
Yeah.
down, they're gonna just shut down, they're gonna be stressed. and
Right,
they're gonna Close
right,
up
right.
shop. And,
Well, it's certainly not as good as where.
right, yeah,
on the
on
other
the
side of
south
the
side that
ridge.
you had great growth.
Yeah, and I think we weren't actually trying to prove the water quality improvements of an oyster bed.
Yeah.
The whole point of this study was to see if we could grow an oyster
Yeah.
bed that would survive. So the idea we were hoping, and because Hui was already doing science there and could collaborate with us, they were going to try to look at if they saw any differences. And one of the things that they did want to see about is the carbon, but they didn't really see much. And 300,000 oysters is fairly much a drop in the proverbial bucket. So I don't think we were going to impact. We could have if we had gotten, you know, millions of oysters to grow in this bed, but I think moving forward, we were just
Well, the thing is,
trying
you do
to change
have
the
the,
modality.
you do have the data in the report, some data about nitrogen. So I'm not sure how to think about that data, as well as chlorophyll. So in terms of all the variables that are out there.
There's a lot of
Yeah,
variables.
Yeah, so, anyway,
Okay.
Thank you for that.
yeah.
There was a couple of details, I guess, that you might want to follow up on, but I think we have a group from Oyster Pond here who's been very patient. So we'll move on to the Oyster Pond Revised Draft Alternative Analysis. And I'm sorry John's not here. This is a subject you probably can live without hearing.
Yeah.
But thank you,
Thanks.
thank you
Thank
once
you
again
very
for
much.
coming.
Thank you, great to see you. Thank you.
You know, as we know, we've been working on this for a while. There's been a working group for the last few months that have gone into the weeds on this subject and gone back and forth with the consultant with specific questions that had come up in the course of evaluating the pros and cons of the different ways of treating oyster pond's nitrogen problem. So the summary here is that there were half a dozen questions that went to the consultant, and we have an answer back. And I think if Sia could kind of give us a summary of the answer back, we could have a discussion of it. Is there a handout here? with
Yep,
this?
I have handouts. I think just in terms of putting this work in context, Wright Pierce worked with the town and had a meeting and got through something called a needs assessment and an alternatives analysis draft. So that draft, when we went back to look at some of the calculations as we were starting to look at watershed planning and innovative alternative septic systems, when we went back and looked at the draft, it was difficult to deconstruct the numbers that Wright Pierce had given us. And so OPED had questions and the committee had questions in terms of trying to analyze what they had actually done. And so the purpose of this exercise is to finish the alternatives analysis, is to get ourselves out of the draft to a final alternatives analysis, which is sort of a milestone in the comprehensive wastewater management plan development process. So we get to the alternatives analysis. The next step is going to be the needs assessment and all of that, which has built into it a very robust public process, because this is sort of the math and the numbers. And you want to make sure your numbers are good and you know what the assumptions are behind your numbers. But ultimately, there are non-cost factors that are going to go into this. So with that context, I'm just going to go, I didn't print out everything, but there are two sort of key pieces to it, the sort of answer, if you will. And I do have one for you. And there is a table that compares the septic, the innovative alternative, septic alternative to the sewer alternative. And then there's the backup page that, I'm not talking from microphone. So I'm just going to pass you the.
And there was the assumptions.
Yeah, and those are some of the assumptions, and I'm going to go through. Right. Well, and I'm just going to, there are two different pages. I'm just going to give these to you, Tom, and have you pass those off to the committee, in case anybody doesn't have them. So we had 8 pages of questions. Well, they weren't 8 pages. We had a number of questions, and between the questions and the answers, we wound up having 8 pages. Do that there. So the first question was really about what were your assumptions going into this, and we wanted to understand how many dwelling units, what peaking factor did you use, just what cost numbers did you use, just to understand what the planning assumptions were that went into the table numbers. So we've got answers to those. We wanted to understand, because it was hard when you looked at the tables, how many dwelling units were being discussed in each of these. And so we now have a more clear explanation of, for the sewer plan, how many units, for the IA plan, how many units, at current conditions, what happens at build out. So we got answers to those questions. And then we had some specific questions about the costs for the installation of low pressure pumps, because that's a pretty big cost in the collection system. And we had real information from the Little Pond area. So we wanted to make sure that the assumptions that were being used were comparable to the real information that we have. So these are questions relating to the number of units, current conditions versus build out. I'm now on G, I'm kind of moving quickly. We wanted to see the worksheets behind how the nitrogen removal was done and what it included. So part of what they provided back to us were those background worksheets. And then we looked at, and we wanted to understand how they actually calculated the linear feet of sewer line, because that affects the cost of the sewer system fairly significantly, and which pump station they used. And it turned out that they revised it to use the Main Street station because that was a more practical station to use. And there was mention in the report in several places and calculations for fertigation and phytoremediation. And we weren't sure. We thought they had included that in the calculations, but apparently they hadn't, so we just were clarifying that. So the first set of questions and responses, number 1, were all about what assumptions went into the calculations. So we got answers to those. And then we also wanted to look at the operation and maintenance numbers for both the sewer and the IA systems and find out from Wright Pierce what they had used and what the Barnstable County cost report really had in it. And what Wright Pierce had based a lot of this on is a report that was done in 2010 and then was updated in 2013. And we felt that we had more ground truthed information because they hadn't really taken out in that county report the different parts of operation and maintenance. And we have our own wastewater treatment facility, so we know what those real costs are. So we went back and talked about, instead of using, they had started out using one number, and we wound up revising the table based on a number for our actual plant, as opposed to this county study that was more general. And then for the on-site systems, they didn't have a separate number in the Barnstable County cost report. It was operation, maintenance, monitoring, everything was sort of lumped together, but we wanted to be more precise than that. So we talked about some different ways of doing that, and that's what's in that Appendix G, as more of the specifics. And then question number 3, we asked how many linear feet and was that the right number for the sewer line, so for the collection system, and how they actually calculated the equivalent annual cost. We wanted to know what assumptions they had for the cost of money and other factors that can change things fairly significantly. We wanted to make sure that we hadn't missed any costs. So we asked them that, and they thought it was complete. We asked them about the Tmdl for phosphorus and whether it was, because one of the things they talk about is phosphorus in the report, and we asked them why, and it's because they had taken OPET data, given it to Woods Hole Group, and Woods Hole Group had thought that it could be, in some cases, that phosphorus was important, and that is why they keep it in there, because of the OPET data and the Woods Hole Group analysis. So moving right along, we also, the working group, because we have information from West Falmouth and because we have George Heufelder, we were able to look at real costs for installing IA systems exclusive of landscaping, because landscaping costs are so variable. We wanted to have a number that we thought was reasonable based on our experience, and so we looked at a number and suggested $26,000 and went back and forth, and so that became the basis of doing a revision to the table based on they had originally had almost, I think, 40,000. I don't remember the exact number, but looking at maybe it was 30, but looking at a number that both Wright Pierce thought was reasonable and we thought was reasonable for the actual cost. And we still have to provide a memo to them that gives us cost basing, so we do need to provide them the reason for that 26, but based on the information we have from West Falmouth, it's there. And then we had a very different monitoring program than what they had originally, and the working group's version is based on conversations with DEP, with George, going through all of our municipal management framework, and that is why there are several different analyses in that table that I passed out. There's a high and there's a low. One is a higher one that includes some items that Wright Pierce wanted to include, and the other was the more optimistic monitoring. And then the costs, and that sort of explains in, I guess, attachment G where those numbers come from for operation and maintenance, how many visits you need to operate and maintain your system, and what the cost of that would be. And those came directly from Barnstable County Department of Health and Environment. So the numbers that we provided to Wright Pierce came from Barnstable County for what a management system would be coming from them. And so for sewers, we had installation and capital costs for the pump that we shared with Wright Pierce through our wastewater planning department. And they used, as you can see in here, a little bit of a higher cost. They carried $10,000 for the installation of those, which again feeds into the capital cost, and then for the two different options. And I guess last but not least, they had originally, when they did the first alternatives of analysis, didn't include any cost for a discharge site. So there was a zero carried for if you were going to sewer, what a discharge site would be. And at the time, we were really, we hadn't finished doing the alternatives analysis, but now we had figures from the Site 7, which is the actual cost of, not including land, because there wasn't a land cost, but it was to build the discharge site for a certain number of gallons. And so what Wright Pierce did is said, okay, if it's 270,000 gallons and it costs this, what's the per gallon cost for a discharge site? And since it was, a quarter of that, half a third of that for this, what is a reasonable number to carry for a discharge site, just to try to get an apples to apples comparison. And so then there's a revised table 5.8, which is the table that was in the alternatives analysis that did a number of things, which is increased the contingency for public projects and reduced it for private projects, because a private project doesn't have as big a contingency for us. And then updated the plans and used the 26,000 for the initial cost of an IA system, and included the first year of monitoring in that capital cost, and then looked at a discharge cost, the operation and maintenance cost, and then updated, sorry this is so boring, but updated the two different scenarios, the sewer scenario and the IA scenario, to account for these refinements. And that is what we have in front of us.
I've got 3 questions. On the page that has table 5.9,
Yeah, I'm going to get a 5.9.
Where's the 5.8?
The extras are.
Oh, from the file?
I just figured to have one. Same thing everybody else does.
Table 5.9.
footnote 2, you're using different percentages for debt service for public and private. Is that based on the 70-30 split?
No. That is based on our conversations in the working group that, in fact, there are 2 different ones, 2 debt services. For Plan 1, which is the sewer, it is a 0% loan. So it's an SRF at 0%.
For the total, for 100% of it?
For 100% of it.
Okay.
So the conservative optimistic A is based on 2% for the public cost. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, in other
That
words,
is-
you need another fraction there to come
Yep.
up with an answer.
2%, yeah, and I think it is a 70-30 split.
Okay.
And it's in the notes. So let me look it up, but keep talking and I'll make sure that that's
you
true.
don't have to give me the answer now, but it has to come out at some point.
Yep.
And then the second question is the Plan 5 optimistic B, is that based on our most recent 1 monitoring event per year?
Yes.
Okay. And the last question is, does it include landscaping?
No.
Yeah, both, whether it's a sewer or an IA, there's going to be landscaping, and they're probably going to be sort of the same, because you're digging up somebody's yard.
Good point.
Thanks, Eric. You sent out around a report from Wright Pierce to this meeting, which I've looked at, printed out. And when I look at it, it looks, in terms of of course, this is revised 2014. This is table 5H, and that was just sent to us as for the meeting with a February 11th, 2017, for June 2017 from Wright Pierce, and it's part of that report. This is table 5.8, which seems to be old, but it was in that, what you sent to the committee.
So Wright
Someone sent
Pierce,
it to the committee. I don't know who sent it.
I sent it. Wright
Yeah.
Pierce sent us a PDF. That PDF included the 8-page question and answer and a
Yeah.
number of attachments. So all of the attachments and the 8 pages
Yeah,
came from Wright Pierce as one package. They included 5.9 because I think they reference it in some of their responses to our questions. That's why it's there.
okay, so when I look at table 5.9, just to be clear, it says Plan 1,
Yep.
Meet Tmdl at current conditions.
Mm-hmm.
By what method?
That's
By sewer.
Sewer.
Does it say sewer?
It probably should.
Yeah, it should be labeled there, but.
It doesn't say sewer? It doesn't say sewer, so I have
Plan
no idea.
one means sewer from the old document.
Right, but I
Yeah.
don't know if it is or what it is, because it doesn't
Well,
say
it's
exactly.
sewer.
Plan
Okay.
1 is sewer.
Okay, then meet Tmdl at Plan 5 is current conditions, which is, I guess, IA. I
That's
guess.
correct.
I'm only
Yeah.
guessing.
All three Plan 5s are IA.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah.
They're just different assumptions.
All right, so when you start to look at the costs for the various systems, if we look at just at the dollar equivalent annual cost per pound of nitrogen removed line, clearly the lowest cost is sewer by highly significant amount, compared to any of the other Plan 5s per pound. I mean, and that adds up. So it seems the sewer is still the best from that standpoint. But then when you go to phosphorus, which we've discussed with OPET, and that the phosphorus control is also considered to be an important factor, that is like 10 times more costly with IAs versus sewer. So I just, in looking at this, it seems that we haven't moved that much from the previous. I mean, it's great to have the updated information. I mean, it's good because it's more real. Maybe it's more. I assume it must be better. But still, we're in a position here where, in talking to the residents or considering by the residents, that the costs are, there's something else I don't quite follow. If we look at the metric section of this table, okay, the folks at home can't see this, but sorry about that. But but if you look at that, the cost per dwelling unit served is not that different. It's like 3,500 to 4,200 or something, 3,600, whatever it may be, 3,400.
Yep.
But when you get to the nitrogen, the cost per pound removed, it's much more expensive with the IA systems. And for the phosphorus removal, which has a question mark after it for some reason, but it's like tenfold more costly with IA systems. So I don't quite understand that how the cost per unit dwelling can be similar unless it's just anyway. What I'm saying is that there is, well, maybe that's not per unit. It's just the total cost per dwelling, but the actual cost in terms of the remedy of reducing nutrient flow into Oyster Pond is far more costly with IAs than it is for sewers with any of these scenarios. And that is a concern, I think, particularly for the homeowners. I mean, they should be aware that that's something. But if the sewer is a viable option, it looks like that's the winner according to this. You know.
But the cost per dwelling unit is only 3/4 with the IA versus sewer.
But that doesn't. But when it comes down to removing,
Well, I know.
running
I'm
the
just
thing and
saying.
everything else. The second element, another element to all of this, another important element is that with the IA systems, each household has got to have the competency and the dedication to managing and
Right.
running the thing.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? With the sewer system, it's more or
You're
less,
hooked up,
as
you're
they
hooked
say,
up.
flush it and forget it.
Yep.
But the thing is that, this is the economics are very clear, and the complexity is.
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because there's been another working group working on the grant that we got from the county to develop an IA
Management framework.
protocol.
Yeah.
And we've been backing and forthing with DEP on what should be in that and what
Right.
it should be. And the direction that's been going, and it'll be rolled out in the reasonably near future as we consolidate the thing. But where that has sort of been going is that the municipality will have more of a responsibility here. It won't be Harry homeowner obliged to take on all these tasks himself. It'll be the municipality. Harry homeowner will pay an annual fee to the town, but the town will either contract out or do it itself, the monitoring and the operation and the maintenance and the pump out periodically. Basically trying to keep it equivalent to the impact on the sewer owner, which is, as you say, the town does it all.
Well, no, that's okay. I mean, that's a good point. That might be
Yeah.
why the costs go up, because you have to pay the town to carry it. So I understand that.
So that's a big piece of the
Yeah.
puzzle here.
And another element, though, and there was a comment made that the land cost for Site 7 was at no cost to the town. Well, there's an opportunity cost to the town.
Well, no, you're quite right. And if we
but
were,
anyway,
and
yeah.
you're right, if we were adding discharge site, first of all, we'd have to find one. Second of all, we'd have to buy it. Third of all, we'd have to get it permitted.
Oh, we have one now, right?
Well, we have one now that has enough capacity to deal with Heights and Mara Vista. It doesn't have enough capacity to deal with a whole lot of more effluent.
Well, I think, as I recall it, maybe Virginia knows better than I remember, but there is quite a bit of scope for Site 7, I think.
Well,
you know.
it got increasingly narrowed over the process of being permitted. And so there actually is not a lot of discharge capacity there.
But it's included in here as a viable option.
Yes, I agree. And that's
Okay,
because
so-
Oyster Pond
Yeah.
itself, just Oyster
Yeah,
Pond
yeah,
and
yeah.
these 200 houses,
Right.
I think that will fit.
And that could be accommodated.
But
Okay.
beyond that, I
So
think
it's not the windfall for the rest of the
For the
Southwest
rest of
Estuary.
the-
Not at all.
That's
Okay.
correct.
All right,
That was one of the hardest things we had to do here, is to deal with how do you measure the cost of additional
Right, but,
discharge capacity, as you know.
yeah, but if it's very limited, it may be that this is the right scale to use it because of the
It-
few houses,
it-
relative to a couple hundred houses.
It could be,
Yeah.
if that was the extent of the sewering the town was planning to do.
But if we did major sewering in Seacoast Shores, that Site 7 is not going to be the.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Any additional sewering beyond the 25,000 gallons a day here would break the bank. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, but as I look at this,
Yeah. The other thing we did not do, and we haven't done yet, is work out what the actual cost to the homeowner is for both of these options. I mean, $704 per pound of nitrogen is an interesting figure, but it has nothing to do with how much the homeowner is going to pay. And that, we haven't done that because we've been still trying to get as definitive a word out of DEP as we can as to what exactly is going to be expected and what it's going to cost to do. Bill, you guys can sit in the front, by the way. Come on up, come on
Wait,
up.
wait.
You have to go to the microphone.
Yeah,
Oh, thank you, Wendy.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wendy Whistler, Quantified, Trust Executive Director. Could you explain a little bit more detail about the different, the conservative, optimistic, and the different plans, fives, what the difference is between them?
Yes. I want to answer Steve's question. So Steve, on page 7, where it talks about revised 5.8, it says that 30%, that 30-70 split is used. Actually, on page 9. So I just wanted to answer your quick question. And now, so Wendy, if you look at attachment G, which is the second thing we handed out, you see compliance, optimistic, and conservative.
Yeah.
That shows you all the differences in the pumping frequency. Basically, Wright Pierce wanted to have a conservative range. So we have a conservative and an optimistic. The conservative requires pumping of your system every 3 years. The cost for septage is higher, obviously, because you're bringing it there more. The electricity costs are the same. the annual fee for recording is the same, the maintenance is the same, the number
It's
of.
really how many monitoring and inspection events.
Yeah, well, I was just kind of going through it, yeah, so
Yep.
the differences are the monitoring, the inspections, the number of them, and if you need a return visit. And so that's the conservative. The third optimistic B also included a 0% SRF. This is like channeling Matt Patrick, who said there's a hidden advantage to sewering if you have a 0% SRF, so there's no cost of money. So what we wanted to do is try to make this as much of an apples to apples comparison, just to get the numbers right, not to talk about all the non-cost factors or the other things that really are the decision-making points, but to say at least we see equally, if you were going to give a sewer a 0%, what it would look like if you also gave an IA a 0%
But
on the interest.
But Eric, you said that was like dreaming, to think of a 0% SRF loan for
That's what we do here.
for an IA system.
Yeah.
It is.
I mean, it may happen, I mean.
Well, having an IA system that's approved for under 10 is also dreaming.
Yeah.
You know, there's plenty of dreaming going on here.
All right, okay, all right, I just wanted to-
But these are not crazy dreams.
Yeah, right.
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 The idea that the SRF program could be modified to allow for a 0% for IAs, you know, it's not off.
Doesn't the county get 0%?
They get it for 0 and they charge
They
5.
charge 5. I know, but, okay.
But that's only for failed septic system, it's not for
Oh,
IAs.
okay.
But that's the kind of thing you can tweak.
Yeah, okay.
SRF can be tweaked, it's been tweaked already to go for the 0 for the sewers, so it's conceptually tweakable.
Just a tiny nitpicking point, but I think it's confusing to people and could be fixed in the next version. On attachment G, you have the three, in the second box, you have the 3 columns for the advanced IAs. I don't think they're in the same order left to right as they are on attachment E.
E?
Attachment E.
We don't know which is.
You've handed out 2 pages,
Right,
attachment
right.
G and attachment E.
Right,
Yep.
yes, the
Each of them has 3 different
yeah, it says
degrees of
Yeah, right,
conservatism
right,
or
right.
optimism,
Right.
but they're not in the same order.
Chairman, I'd like to be excused. I've got another commitment at 5:30.
Well, you were excused, and
Thank you.
thank you for joining us. We will.
can take care of that.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
what Pierce is doing, right?
Like we have.
Yeah,
They prepared these,
yep.
so,
Eric, we have this.
Bill.
Hi. Thanks. Bill Kerfoot. I'm actually not sitting on the board of directors right now of OPET, although you have probably known in the past that I've been reviewing the material very carefully, and it will take time to look at this. It's not hard. There are some questions, though, that are coming up. I think I certainly immediately second Eric's comment that you're going to have to look at what's the cost to the homeowner, because of course they look at that. And in the metrics, again, I don't have the other tables with me. Most interesting is that the number of dwelling units served by the sewering alternative is 40% less than the numbers being required by the Plan 5. And I'd like to, I think I know what the answer is, but I'd like to hear it. It's not really spelled out here.
Sewering takes all the nitrogen away, and the IAs take not all the nitrogen
You know,
away.
if we go with George's 78% type of situation, if you go through our calculations on different alternatives, it would be somewhere around there.
So you need more homeowners
But-
to put in IAs to get the same amount of nitrogen out.
Yes, but when you think of it as being the 78%, which was on the multicolored table before, that means that that was a difference of 22, not 40%. So it doesn't seem to add up. So if you go back when we did our multicolor, if we each system removed 78%, And in that particular case, George was saying, okay, if we have 45 parts per million at the source, which was the septic tank, and we treated it with denitrification to the point where it was below 10 going out, then we could all agree we could meet the total Tmdl requirement. So that's not
No,
equivalent to 40%.
The basis
removal.
of the calculation is the MEP report, and one of the things that Wright Pierce provided are their calculations on Tmdl compliance.
Yep.
So you have about 2,000, they have pounds. There's a certain amount that you have to remove. You're starting with the MEP assumption of 26.25 kilograms. So the 78%, you're either going to 10 or you're going to 0. And if you want to see the Wright Pierce calculations, you can, but you need X number of
Yep.
IA systems.
So
and-
we would like to have if they've
Sure.
been revised and reviewed, we'd like to see the current ones from
Where
Wright Pierce.
are
Yeah, they
you
haven't
getting
been
the
rev-
40% number? I'm not seeing the 40%.
Oh, just simply by taking the fact that they're using 204 units versus 145 units
Yeah.
on here. There's only 145 that's stated here that needs to be sewered, but there are 204 needed to be sewered for the IA systems.
The other factor, and you'll see this, it's not quite linear, is certain dwelling units use more water, single family versus condo.
Yes.
And so, once you get some of the multifamily and the duplexes in the mix, and then you look at single family homes, the numbers change differently because of the water use differences. And that's why Wright Pierce, and that's why we asked Wright Pierce to see their home, to see the backstory, so we would understand which units at which water use. And that didn't change from the original alternatives analysis.
Well,
Also, Bill, it's more like 30%.
just, well.
Did you do the math?
There's a calculation discrepancy we'd like to
No.
just, again,
I don't
we just
think so.
received the material. We'd like to.
Yeah, no,
hear-
that's fair.
hear a little bit
We
more
did
on
send
that.
them the entire package, right?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
And
Well,
there
we will
has
send you
been-
the, we,
29%.
There has been some considerable discussion about the water use, hidden water use situation on fluctuation for toilets and other thing, and how it's changing the mass productions that we'd so like to talk with you later on, having to do with the monitoring situation, but I don't think it's appropriate here. But it is important in the overall perspective of how things should be monitored for an individual compliance. I do see the other aspect questions come having to do with looking at the approximate breakdown of costs, which is, I'm very glad to see this. I mean, we haven't had the more detail from the county at the present time relative to their costing situations. And I was glad to hear that instead of the 40,000 that you stated now, that the cost is more like 26,000 for an installation situation. The one question came up too with regard to previously, after the last materials, was that the comment was made, well, we're getting our costs, by Wright Pierce, getting our costs for the lateral length, for, in other words, all the collection system and laterals to the individual homes, from the cost of the little pond. And the question was raised before, well, the runs on Little Pond are in the outwash plain. They're not on the moraine. When you go on the moraine and in the area, say trying to go to Hui for treatment connections or lines like around the Woods Hole Research Center, you almost always run into a 20 to 30% higher cost because you run into all these boulders that you have to take care of on the moraine situation.
That's a good point.
And he included that. We talked to them
and
about
one factor
that.
that ameliorates that is the fact that these are going to be all low pressures.
Yeah.
Whereas over in the other area, they were doing gravity in at least half of them, but in your area, it's going to be all low pressure, which is smaller pipes, and then not as far down, and they don't have to deal with
I totally
different kind of
agree
engineering.
That, I mean, you don't have a choice.
No,
You
you
have to
don't
go
have a
low
choice.
pressure.
Right. But
Alternatives, but you still have to dig the pathway down
Oh, yeah.
a certain distance to avoid freezing
Freezing, yeah.
situations
Yep,
there.
and that was one of our
That was one of
questions.
our questions.
That's what we were trying to do. This was a really good exercise in looking at these two options for a collection system using all low-pressure systems and comparing them. And, you know, the difference even in the dollars per kilogram is 25%. I mean,
I
it's,
think you had commented on this before, Bill, and I think that your comments were incorporated in the analysis, considering the moraine and the boulders and all the difference.
Right, just
As far as I know.
Request here is
Yeah.
if we could have some of the breakdown
Yep.
aspects, just to see how they dealt with it,
Can we
that's
get a
all.
copy of?
Absolutely, yeah.
Sure,
who should we send it to?
To
To you? Okay.
sure. Yeah. Keeping in mind that the operation and maintenance piece is in flux,
Yes.
very recent conversations have given the other working group a reason to keep the door open on those subjects.
I know, it's still a bit of a headache, as you know, from our side, because we have people like John Dowling, who isn't here right now,
Yeah.
who's our president, who has been paying basically about $325 for the analysis situations, and I still come down here and it's looked like I'm doing $700 and $200, makes $900 on the monitoring situation per home. But again, like to see, you just supplied this information.
Right.
We have to look at it.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
Obviously, we would ask George to provide some more information on that and things like that. So we very much appreciate the information.
Well, it's very much a work in progress. We're learning something every day.
I just asked then, what's the next step? So now that we've gotten these assumptions answered, or what the assumptions were, so what's going to be the next step in the process for the CWP?
Well, our IA working group is not done.
Okay.
And until they are, these aren't done.
Yes, okay. Yeah, because because I guess the costs are still in flux, and then, at some point, then you have to go to the state, right, and get...
Well, the long-term plan, to the extent we have one, is we have a document that's due to the state at the end of 2019 for the estuaries, the south-facing estuaries in Westfalen. Our premise here is that Oyster Pond will be brought into the mix at that same time with its own CWMP. And in that CWMP, there'll be a recommendation for dealing with Oyster
for
Pond,
one of these
one way or another.
choices.
So that's the time frame.
Yeah.
So we do have time to fine-tune this, and we have time to give the community plenty of input as to what choice it wants to see happen, but that's the time frame.
So at what point will there be like a neighborhood meeting? When do you think that will happen in the process? I'm just, because I'm
Probably
sure
not-
we'll be asked that question.
Probably
Not
not this
this
summer,
summer.
just because too much
Right.
is in play
Uh-huh.
to be able to give definitive answers, but definitely,
Probably
Next summer.
before, certainly next summer.
But, Eric,
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you can summarize the take-home lesson as this, from these figures, that are going to be daunting to a lot of people. The bottom line is that they're getting very close, Plan 1 and Plan 5. Neither one is a slam dunk obvious thing.
Right.
It's not, one is not 10 times the other one. And there continue to be all kinds of adjustments. So that's and there are all kinds of external factors, like what's going to happen to the other estuaries.
Right.
So that's a way of
What
saying,
treatment, yeah.
it's one of these, but we don't know.
Yeah, it's still a work in progress, basically, and
Is that fair?
Yes.
Actually, a question for Wendy and Bill, actually, and maybe Steve as well. The dredging that was done
Yes.
last fall, I guess it was, seems to have helped a lot. I'm just wondering if.
Well, I don't know if you've seen the lagoon lately.
The lagoon I know is,
Yeah.
the lagoon I know is a problem. But,
Got an island.
but for Oyster Pond though, I'm not sure what to do about the lagoon, but is Oyster Pond?
Well, we're going to be, hopefully I'm going to go out and sample the pond
Okay.
this Saturday. And
Well,
once those samples are analyzed, we'll have a little bit, but the salinity, there is salinity now at the bottom of the kettle hole
Uh-huh.
at the lower part, which is at 10.1 parts per thousand. The entire pond, the last time I checked it a few weeks ago, was 1.5. During the worst of the algal bloom, it was less than 1.
I see.
So it has come up a little bit. We'd like it to be a little bit higher.
I was there in the middle of April and it was very green. I was,
Yeah.
just in my own subjective
Right,
view,
and-
but it
yeah,
looked
and
strangely green.
we
but
looked at it in
yeah.
detail and it looked fine.
Looked fine,
But
okay.
for some reason, the
You
lagoon.
could have seen green from the basis of reflection of
Yeah, it
light
could have been, right, I
at
was
a
just,
particular angle, but it actually was so clear that when you put in
Yeah,
our...
the secchi
Secchi
disc.
disc.
The secchi disc was
Okay.
down to, I think, almost 6 feet.
well, this was off Spore Garden, like off that
Yeah,
side.
yes.
I don't know what.
No, but the clarity is quite, it was quite great when I
It
went
looked
out.
like a very healthy
like,
green.
I went out like,
So-
yeah, I went out like a month ago and it was
Oh, good.
quite deep.
Okay.
And I'm going out again on Saturday and
Okay,
hopefully
okay.
find out.
Okay, thank you. Any other?
Yes.
Yes, John.
I'm Richard Hale. Although I am on the Treetops board, I'm actually asking questions for Treetops condominium where I'm a resident, former board member. And there are always two questions that residents have. One is when, and the other is how much. And I realize
Very good question.
yes, the answers don't
Yep.
exist today. And Wendy's question about what's next, I think, is helpful information, you know. But the how much question, I've been asked in various forums that question, and there's no answer to it. But one resident recently asked me, or said to me, that is it reasonable to assume that we would pay pretty much what other homeowners in Falmouth have paid for their sewers? And I don't know the answer to that. The cost to the town of Falmouth for installing their part of it is somewhat interesting to residents, but what's really interesting is what do I have to pay?
Right.
And, in terms of what the state or the town subsidizes and covers for that. So is there any answer that I could give to frame people's thinking about that at this point in the process?
Yes and no.
What would you say,
What would
Steve?
you say?
Well, I would look at this capital cost per dwelling unit served. Again, see, they're in the same ballpark. I mean, they're of the order of 20 to 40,000. I mean, you could say, whoa, well, that's a big difference. But it's not 2,000 and it's not 200,000.
Right.
And the 70-30 split is sort of
What
in
is
the culture of Falmouth,
Yeah.
Okay.
but it's
Yes.
not guaranteed.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, the 70-30 split for the folks in the Heights and Mara Vista worked out to a betterment of $16,000 in round numbers. And an annual cost between the betterment was $540 for them. And they have an annual sewer fee based on the amount of water they use, but that also worked out to about, for an average of $540 a year. So those are the numbers that you're going to get from the Heights Mara Vista experience. It won't be any less.
I'm sure. Well, that's really what I think people are looking for. That the Treetops community is very interested in the health of Oyster Pond for
Sure.
obvious reasons, and so they are not to a person, but certainly as a community, very positively disposed towards solving the issue. And I think the question that I've been asked is sort of their informal. I will say it's informal representative. There's no formality to me being here and speaking or asking questions for the community, but it's just fairness vis-a-vis the rest of the town, and I'm sure you hear that from every neighborhood that you've talked to. Great, thank you.
Yes, tell them not to worry that it's going to happen anytime soon. Because
That would be the best news.
Hey, we're not even having the neighborhood meeting till next summer.
Right, yes, and filing a CWMP and having it approved doesn't mean we start digging the next week, or even the next month, or even the next year. The town has its own schedule for capital outlay.
Not that this factors into anything you do, but on the sort of midterm plan for renewing the treetops area, completely digging up and replacing things like water lines and redoing all of the roads will be happening at some point in a, in a plan of some number of 2 or 3, 5 years. I'm not really sure what that is. Again, I'm not on the board. But so with that, prior to that happening, I'm sure the question will be asked very pointedly, like, well, when are we going to have to dig for this? And so,
If you could keep us abreast of that, that's important to know, because there's nothing people hate more than putting
yes.
down a nice, fresh coat of asphalt and watching someone dig it up.
And also the IA systems, you can just think about it technically, are like Title V systems. They have the same leaching field.
mm-hmm.
And in treetops, you have the option of a cluster system, which is, but that's an option. And the leaching field wouldn't be any worse than what you've got now. And if it works, you can use the same one.
Right.
Plus some extra tanks, which would probably be in what I would call the backyards, the ponds, the downhill, wherever they are now.
I don't know.
If the IA is the answer, if the sewer is the answer, it probably would be, you'd use the same tanks in the low pressure sewers and you'd route the collecting line, whatever would be the simplest way, which again I suspect is through the backyards. But you actually have an advantage since you're a corporation that you can say where it is.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, we'll think about those things when we have to, I guess.
Yes.
But I will keep you informed of the plan.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, report of members and staff. I know Virginia's been to a couple of meetings.
You'll remember that we've had 2 discussions on the committee about this IA protocol, the monitoring plan for IAs. And the request after the last meeting was to ask if we could have a meeting, or input, I guess I should say, from DEP. So there actually have been 2 meetings. We met with Brian Dudley, Eric and I, and Sia, and just sort of walked through the version that we had at that point, and got some clarification from Brian as to what he was thinking. And then we subsequently have met with Gary Moran, who is in Boston, and is more or less the point person for the DEP on the CWMPs for the state, and he's certainly involved with the various planning projects on the Cape. So Eric used the word work in progress earlier. The IA protocol is still a work in progress, but I think it's moving forward to a document that is workable. We have not provided specifics yet to Boston DEP, but based on that input, the working group for the IAs needs to meet again and look at a later version. That's where we are.
So Moran hasn't seen that draft that
No.
Brian has seen.
That's right, and Brian Dudley saw an earlier draft and had sort of
Right.
editorial comments about it.
Okay, any other report of members and staff?
I just have a question, that it's something you touched on, Eric, and I've been meaning to bring this up, is that Peter Boyer had come up with this financing plan for whatever system they were thinking about many years ago, the previous committee especially, or even before that, I think. But I'm just wondering now, I mean, that had an assumption of retired debt being used for using that opportunity to finance these things. Well, since he prepared that concept, we've had several big ticket items that came up. One was the water filtration plant, and now we have a $10 million senior center. Then there was the windows for the Lawrence School, $3 million. So these things keep building up. We're in the $65 million roughly range. And I'm just wondering if at some point, probably not now, probably as part of the process of moving toward the December 31st, 2019 filing that we are expected to do, that we will, I guess we'll have to revisit that as it goes. But, yeah.
This is a very important part of the whole planning process, as planning a project and then being able to fund it.
Yeah.
So all of this planning, at least in my head, has been in concert with that original plan. It was a 40-year plan.
Yeah.
40-year plan, and it identified particular times when there would be significant retirement of debt so that new debt could be issued and keep the tax rate level. So the next window is 2025, and that fits pretty well with the work that we're doing now. We'll have all of the demonstration projects to a significant point of being able to say how useful they are and how much nitrogen they remove. And that will be part of our filing of the CWMP update in 2019. In that update, I would anticipate that we would begin to look at what's our recommendation for the next construction project. And with the aim that it would have gone through the town meeting, and there's a filing that you have to do for an SRF, you know, that all those rigmaroles that we went through to get through Little Pond will now be done for whatever the next recommendation is. So that plan still exists. I have met with Jennifer, wasn't last month, was the previous month, to verify that this 2025 target date for the next retirement of debt is still on the table, and the answer is yes. The projects that you mentioned in asking your question, those already were incorporated into that planning document, so they have not changed any window. They were all in the fitted in, including the senior center.
I thought there was $100 million for wastewater though, and then it was split. When the water filtration came up. It's not, this is just a detail, I just don't know.
Right, that is
but
just-
they're looking forward, are there more water filtration
No,
type
no.
things? I mean, I'm not another one. I mean, what I mean is that are there
other huge
large-scale,
projects
huge
like that?
projects?
In other words, your planning is excellent, but are there other committees, just like ours, meeting secretly on Wednesdays that are planning to use the same money at the same time?
Well, that's.
Not to my knowledge, would be my first answer. And the second is that Jennifer Petit is a very good finance director, and the selectmen are aware of this mechanism that has worked well, this window of opportunity. So she knows exactly how much space there is and when it's timed. We're going to aim for our, and the window in 2025 is $60 million.
So basically, between now and then, we're sitting, waiting for this next thing to happen.
It
right?
will
That's-
take us, after we file this
Yeah.
update in 2019, it will take us those 5 years to design, to get community buy-in, to figure out, the key point is going to be the discharge. Because as we said earlier in this discussion, Site 7 is not going to be able to take a great deal more of.
What about Site 10? That's, not that that's.
I
that's-
can't
yeah.
go into
We're
that.
not
All
gonna-
I'm saying is the discharge,
Yeah.
discharge will be a key piece of that discussion.
But
Okay.
once you've filed in 2019
Yes,
with DEP, right, that's what we filed with?
that's, yes, and me.
Then the town's committed at that point. Then you'd better find
No.
a discharge on
No.
the money,
No.
et cetera, et cetera.
No, the town's not committed at that point. This will be the plan with a recommendation for the specific construction project, and then that will be a separate document.
Okay. Well,
But
anyway.
does the 2019
Thanks, Ron.
plan say that you're going to use sewers or IAs?
We're probably getting too specific at this
It-
point.
It will be a recommendation that addresses that, yeah.
Which
but it-
Might be oysters, come on.
right?
by definition
PRBs.
calls out a certain amount of money.
Kelp,
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 yeah,
Kelp.
yes,
Well,
it will,
It
it
will
will all
fall.
be in that plan.
Okay.
But there'll be a window to do it in the next 5 years after the plan, so. Okay.
We should
vote-
schedule our next meeting.
Oh, well, yeah, give me a second here. Vote of minutes to the prior meetings. Everybody got the copy of the May 18th meeting?
I move that they be approved as written.
Can I have a second
Second.
for discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, opposed? The ayes have it. Everybody got a copy of the June 1st meeting?
Yes,
Move that they be approved as written.
second.
All in favor?
abstain.
Aye.
That's right, you wasn't there.
Right.
Abstain.
Okay, unanimous with one abstention.
Two abstentions.
Two abstentions, you weren't here, that's right, you weren't here either.
That's right.
All right, schedule. I would propose that we meet again on June 29th, which is 2 weeks, and then July 27th, in other words, skip the middle of July, and then August 31st, and skip the middle of August. With the idea that if there was any emergencies or a reason to have a meeting in between, we could do that, but at least this would give folks,
Some
We have a
vacation.
reason for the 29th already?
of July? Oh,
No,
of June.
June.
Not at the moment.
Well, if we do, then we'll
If there's,
do it,
if there's a
yeah.
reason, if nothing significant pops up that we're ready to deal with, we could skip that one.
What's the one in August?
31st.
31st? Basically, it's the last Thursday in July and the last Thursday in August.
I would not be able to attend the meeting on the 29th of June,
Okay.
Okay. Well, that's
if
good.
that factors in.
It does.
So it's the last Thursday in all three of those months.
It
Yes.
is, if we need one in June.
Yeah, well, this month, we've already met twice.
Yeah, we may not. So, is that okay with people?
Well, we
July
need to check
28th?
with John Waterbury too. So,
That's true.
28th?
so tentatively, let's say we have a meeting
Yeah.
for June 29th.
And Tom also.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
right, Tom.
And Tom also.
Okay.
So
Well,
we may or may not have one on the 29th?
We'll send something around and get feedback from the missing folks. And if we have a reason to have one on the 20th, we will, and if we don't have a reason to, we won't. But for July and August, one meeting each month. Work for everybody?
And the
Good.
time of those meetings in July and August would be the morning?
Does everybody like 8:30 better?
8:30 is good.
Yep.
Oh, wait, 8:30? Depends.
8:30 is
Yeah,
better.
that's okay, I can
All right,
keep it.
At 8:30 a.m.?
yeah.
In July and August?
Yep.
Yeah.
Not June?
Not
Or
June.
No?
Right.
Okay. Or June won't be anyway.
We might have the IA thing at the end of June,
Well, we
right?
might. We'll see if we
Yeah,
do.
I think you might have your IA.
Yeah.
So should we meet on the 29th in the morning, too?
Well, yeah, morning.
In fact, we have to, because I have to be in
Yes,
Boston in the
morning it
afternoon,
is.
Okay, so we're
8:30
we're
a.m.
saying 8:30 on June 29th.
if we meet, which we probably
If we're
will.
ready.
June 29th.
Okay. Does Matt have a motion for me?
I would love to give you that. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Do we have a second? Any discussion? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
This made up for a short meeting.
Got it.